Hi, this is Gilles, the radio prepper. In this video, I'm going to talk about all the tricks, well, those I know of, for making successful low-power radio contacts. That's called QRP, whether it's for fun or if your life depends on it. Now, little disclaimer here. For safety, I love those little tiny radios, CW transceivers, but that's not my primary means of, establishing safety, basically. Uh, that is what I count on first and foremost, and that's an inReach. It's a satellite device. But that said, a radio like this one, like the Weber MTR, has 3 bands, 3 amateur bands, and is Morse code only, 5 watts, and has pretty much a global range when the conditions are good. So what it allows me to do, contrary to the inReach, is that the inReach is pretty much a last resort, because once you press that SOS button down here, there is a whole search and rescue operation that's triggered to come and get you. So you don't always necessarily want that. And with a small radio like this, I can actually have a dialogue, more of a conversation with someone, and ask them for information or to gather information for me, or anything that I want to know. I can ask someone to get it for me and transmit it back, maybe send a message to someone. And that's when a tiny Morse code radio really shines. But when you have only 5 watts, you can't really afford to lose any in your setup, basically. So what I'm going to do now is to tell you the tricks that I know to make those contacts, and make sure that even though you have very little power, you can radiate that power efficiently and be successful at making a contact. Number 1, and you probably heard that before, the antenna is everything. Antenna length is very important for radiating all the power that your transceiver is putting into it. And for that, your antenna has to be a half wave. Now, of course, on the lower bands, that means a pretty darn long antenna. On the 80-meter band, it's a 40-meter, 132, 135 feet antenna. And I thought it would be a problem. Most of the time, I would use antennas for the 20-meter band, so about 10 meters long, 33 feet, and put them on a mast, vertical. But of course, on the lower bands, you're much more likely to use a horizontal antenna, because you want to send that power straight up so that it rains down in a regional pattern. That's called NVIS. So stringing an antenna horizontally isn't so much a problem, actually much less than what I thought it would be. So much so that I'm actually considering trying 160 meters. That's a 260 some feet antenna, and that's extremely long. But for portable operation in the field, who really cares? If you have, if you can elevate your antenna just about 6-8 feet from the ground, 10 feet maybe, you're good to go. For that, I use a 64-to-1 transformer. Tiny box here with a toroid inside, an FT82-43. I have videos on this, but basically you just plug in your antenna cable and you put your half-wave wire here, string it up vertically if it's short enough, or horizontally if it's longer, and bingo, you have a very efficient full-size antenna. I was able to throw my wire up this tree and all the way to the other side here is the antenna radiating wire, 134-foot wire. The 49-to-1 transformer is about 8 feet from the ground, and it is receiving extremely well. No surprise with the 134-foot antenna. Now, compromise antennas do work. Actually, I do have a Chameleon M-Pass system right now on my terrace, and I've made quite a few contacts on 30 meters. I also use a 9-to-1 Unun with a random wire, so that's a 9-to-1 transformer basically. As I mentioned before, the Hershey Unun is a 9-to-1 transformer. It's a very light Unun. It's very easy to make. Probably cost about $10. And this works pretty well. I can put a 19-foot wire on this and once again make quite a bit of contacts, even down to 40 meters. Although 40 meters is pushing it, but once again, if you really want to get the most of your antenna, it should be a half wave, it should be a full-size antenna. Which brings me to number 2, use a resonant antenna. Meaning, don't use a tuner if you can avoid it, and use a full-size half-wave antenna, like a dipole or a half-wave unfed antenna. Can be an inverted V or even a quarter-wave vertical with radials, in which case you're much better off that way because you don't have the tuner losses. Some of that power, when you use a tuner, is turned into heat and is not radiated by your antenna. I also, like I showed you, use this 9-to-1 Unun, but that's using a tuner once again. So if you use a tuner, you're going to have those tuner losses. You're much better off with a half-wave antenna, and this way you get, well, most of your power radiated through the antenna instead of lost in the tuner. If you do have to use a tuner for whatever reason, maybe you have a compromised antenna, a random wire or something like that, you're much better off putting the tuner at the antenna rather than at the radio, because you have cable losses. If the antenna impedance and the cable impedance are very different, then the cable is going to be losing power, and quite a bit of it. That's very important. So that's why, once again, I use resonant antennas when I can. I use a 49-to-1 transformer, brings the impedance down to close to 50 ohms, so I don't have to worry about the cable losses. But, you know, it's not always easy to put your tuner at the antenna. And I'm thinking especially of the Elecraft T1 that I have, because once I press the button, I only have so many seconds to run to the radio to transmit to the tuner, actually tunes, to an automatic tuner. So probably a little better to have you know, a manual tuner, or maybe you just fold your cable and you go near the tuner, tune the antenna, you know, using the tuner, and then you can, you know, go back to your operating spot and then it's fine. But always better to put the tuner at the antenna rather than at the radio. That's why I'm not such a big fan of built-in tuners for radios, although of course they can be bypassed and then you can put another tuner at the antenna. But it's always better to have the tuner at the antenna. And to connect the tuner to the antenna or the radio, number 3, coax cable. You don't want to save money on coax cable. You want a good, efficient, low loss cable. If you don't have much power, just a few watts, you don't want to lose half your power in the coax cable. And that's especially true on the higher frequencies. If you're on the 80-meter band, you know, 3.5 megahertz or the 7 megahertz 40-meter band, you don't have to worry too much about it. But as soon as you get a bit higher, even on 20 meters, 14 megahertz, it's going to be a problem. I'm not even talking about VHF or UHF. That's where you have to spend big bucks for your coax cable. What I used to use was a RG174, which is a very thin cable. It's very flexible and it's not that expensive, but it's pretty lossy. And you don't want to use long lengths of it. Basically, I try to limit my coax length to about 5 meters, so about 15, 17 feet. I try not to go longer than that because then you lose a lot of power in the cable, and that's a problem. It's not going to get radiated. Later, I switched to RG316, which is a slightly better cable. It's mechanically stronger, but it's not as flexible. But I like this this cable better because it just lasts longer, basically. Cables the size of RG174 or RG316 I pretty much consider to be consumables. Basically, I know they're going to break at some point because the more you move them, especially near the plug, it's, you know, sooner or later it's going to break. Other than that, I use LMR 240 UF Ultraflex, although it should be called less stiff, but it's LMR 240 UF. That's an RG58 size cable, basically, which is low loss. It's not very flexible, once again, but it's pretty expensive, but you do save a lot of power in that cable, and it's pretty mechanically strong. It's tough, so you're not going to have to buy that cable every 6 months, you know, because it breaks. So that's a good cable. Then for home operations, I use LMR 400, which is the more of an RG213 size cable, low loss, once again, and that's a very high quality cable, but again, very expensive. But it's not something that you can, you know, skip on, well, it's not something that you can, you know, try to save money on, because the cable really is what connects your radio to the antenna, the two most important links in your chain, basically. So buy good coax cable and low loss coax cable if you can. Number 4, still in relation with our feed line system, one thing that you want to be packing in your kit is an RF choke. This is just a small plastic box with a 31 material toroid inside, and a bit of RG174 coax and a few turns around it. And I will make a video about this because I actually want to build a new one. This is inserted into your feed line near the radio. Now, why do we use this? Because if you have an antenna that is not well balanced, basically where the currents are not well balanced, some of those currents, common mode currents, are going to be flowing back on the shield of your coax and go back to the radio. Now, on some radios, especially like this Weber MTR, the electronics, the processor and the keyer chip that's in, actually I think the processor does it, but the processor can be basically messed up by these common mode currents, and the logic of the radio is going to just, you know, it just basically doesn't work. I've had experiences where I use this radio and I don't have a choke. Actually, I had it with me, fortunately, and the keying is all messed up. My keyer was messed up by common mode currents, so I had to add an RF choke in line, which is a good thing to have. Isn't it great when you can just insert your key in a crack in a rock and operate? Couldn't be better. And you know, that is true also of automatic tuners. My T1 tuners doesn't like common mode currents. It just messes up the tuner and it just loses its track, and it does, you know, it just goes crazy basically. So for some uses, of course, you want to try to avoid using this because that induces some losses once again, but sometimes you have to, because otherwise you just can't use your radio. And so that's a great thing to have, is an RF choke in your kit. And, you know, it's small enough, it, you know, just a little bit of coax, and you can plug that in near the radio. Why near the radio? Well, because sometimes having the shield of your coax cable radiating as well isn't such a bad thing if you don't have a counterpoise. So the coax will get rid of that current basically and be part of the antenna system. Now, it's not always a good thing, but when you're using a 9-to-1 Unun, sometimes either you use a counterpoise or you let the shield of the coax do that. But you want to stop the common mode currents before, right before they get to the radio. One thing you can do to help with that also, and that's number 5, is to use a ground. Now, when you do portable operations, you're not always thinking of using a ground. But using a ground can make a big difference in your radiated power, because of course you have the other side of the antenna basically connected to the ground, so that gives you a good ground plane that acts as a reflector basically and helps your signal to get out. Now with the internal tuner I get a very good match. For a very good ground here, I'm going to use this spring and just throw the wire in the water. You can see now the needle goes higher than before. So it also prevents getting nasty needle pricks in your fingers when you touch the metal of your radio or your Morse key, because you have common mode currents and maybe you're not using an RF choke. So it's always a good thing to have a ground, especially if you use very long antennas, because the wind can cause static electricity, and that static electricity has to be bled to the ground basically. In some instances you're going to use a resistor, a high value resistor, maybe 1 mega ohm or 10 mega ohms, from the center of your coax to the shield and then to the ground. Because you don't want to have those high voltages go back to your radio. I can fry your radio. So using a ground is always a good option, especially once again if you leave your antenna up and you go on a hike and there's a thunderstorm and lightning strikes, things like that. But having a ground does improve performance. So when you can use a ground, use a ground. And by a ground, I mean, a spike stuck in the earth with a bit of water on it, or, whatever you have to improve conductivity. If you don't have water, you know what to do. Okay, now we're going to switch to more operational guidelines, so to speak, as opposed to gear. And that will be number 6, is to use an efficient mode. And we don't always think about that, but different modes have different bandwidth, basically the width of the signal. And of course, the wider the signal is, the less power that's going to be radiated. If you have a very narrow signal, like a Morse code tone, it's going to be like a laser, as opposed to a flashlight. And that's a big difference. You can see a laser miles away, just a little laser pointer that's 10 milliwatts. You're going to see it miles away. If you use a flashlight that's 10 milliwatts, you're not going to see much of anything. And that's the same principle, basically. And the modes that we use most often are, of course, single sideband, and that's a 3 kilohertz width, which is actually a pretty good voice mode because it's not that wide and it conveys all the information of the human voice. And that's enough. 3 kilohertz, even probably 2 kilohertz is enough. But for intelligibility, I think 2.5 to 3 kilohertz is what's normally used. Some people use much wider signals because they want to sound, great, like, radio, broadcast radio, but it doesn't matter. Single sideband is a good mode because it's not very wide. But if you take AM, for instance, well, that's twice the width, so about 6 kilohertz, and you lose a lot of power that way. If you have a CB radio, for instance, that has AM and USB and LSB, single sideband, you want to use single sideband because you're going to have much more power than in AM. Same for FM. FM is even worse than that. FM, I think, is like 12 kilohertz, something like that. It's a crazy wide signal. So you don't want to be using modes that are not efficient. Now, for the more efficient modes, of course, are CW, so for Morse code. CW has a width of, it's just a tone, so just a few hertz, it's very powerful. It cuts through much more than voice. And actually 5 watts CW, sounding Morse code, is the equivalent of approximately 100 watts voice mode single sideband. So you are much better off using CW, and that's why a lot of the people who do QRP, low power radio operations, use tiny radios like this one, which is CW, Morse code only. And if it was an SSB, voice mode radio, it would be much bigger, of course, the size of a small brick, probably. Of course, that's much smaller. That doesn't use as much current, and it's tiny, and it works absolutely great. Of course, you have to learn Morse code, but it's not impossible. I've done it, so if I can do it, you can do it. Now we also have digital modes, and digital modes are even more efficient than Morse code. Some modes like JS8 call, JS8 can detect signals that are not audible with the human ear. So that's, I think, 24 decibels below noise level. So if you turn the dial and you hear the static and you just go right by that signal that is there, but you can't hear it, but the computer can decode it. So I always was a bit eerie of digital modes just for the fact that you have to carry more stuff. But I've come around now that we have small devices like the Raspberry Pi and tablets, smartphones, and tiny digital transceivers that can be used for that. So, I've changed my mind a bit about that, and I'm probably going to be using more digital modes because they are more efficient. CW Morse code will always be my favorite, and I'll always have a Morse code radio. And because I think the simplicity there is just cannot be matched as of today anyway. So that's what I use. But keep in mind that to make contact with very little power, you have to use an efficient mode. Number 7, something we forget sometimes, is that height is might. You need to get up there if you can. Altitude-wise. So basically, you're going to be much more efficient. You're going to have a much better signal if you are on a hill or a mountain than if you are at on the ground. And that's pretty. I was going to say at the beach, but if you're at the beach, you have salt water there, and that helps quite a bit too. So. Not always true, but most of the time, especially if you are using handheld radios, and this is more about HF, shortwave, but in between 3 and 30 megahertz. But for using VHF, UHF, you have little power, you have a little handheld radio. It's really the height that you're at that's going to be the deciding factor in your range. And it's somewhat true also of HF, because when you're pretty high up, you don't have any obstacles around you. So there's no tree in the way. There's no, there isn't a forest or another hill or something. And if you're on top and you have a clear view of everything that's around you, obviously your signal is going to be have much more power because there's no obstacles. Height is might, remember. If you can get up there for VHF and UHF, even climbing on a roof or something, oh, don't fall. Okay, I didn't say that, don't do it. But anyway, just, height is going to help you. If you can go up on a hill where you're going to be most successful. Height is might, remember. And we are getting to our last point. Number 8, you have to mind propagation. You have to use the correct band for the time of day, for the time of the year, for the time in the solar cycle. Right now we are at the bottom of the solar cycle, so 20 meters works fine, but 10 meters, not so much. It's hard to make a contact, even on 20 meters sometimes. It's not that easy. You're much better off using 40 and 80 meters, and those are great bands. For NVIS, you're much better off on 80 meters right now. Depending on where you are compared to the, if you are closer to the equator, you can get away with using 40 meters. If you're further up north, you're going to have to use 80 meters for NVIS, Near Vertical Incidence Skywave. You can Google that up. You have to keep in mind that there are bands that work better during the day and bands that work better at night. Once again, 40, 80 meters at night, 30, 20 meters during the day. I don't use bands above 20 meters generally for long distance communications because they are not that reliable. I only use higher bands for local communications, VHF, so that's 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters. 2 meters being the king in that triad. I wish 6 meter was, but nobody uses it, and that's too bad. 6 meter FM, I mean, and that's too bad. It also sometimes can go pretty far too, but that's not very often. And so you really have to keep in mind that you have to choose the correct band. And the radio should have actually a survival, prepping or radio should have at least one night band, so 40 or 60 meters, and one day band, 30, 20 meters. And that's, gives you the best of both worlds, basically. You'll be able to communicate during the day and at night and using NVIS or long distance DX. Of course, for UHF and VHF, that's more of a local proposition, although sometimes you can get regional ranges with tropospheric ducting and things like that. But those modes of propagation do not happen very often. You can't count on them. The only thing you can count on is the ionosphere. And the ionosphere is, it's very peculiar. It doesn't work all the time either. Although 80 meters is probably your best bet for evening night communications. So make the right choice. All right, I hope you are all doing fine. Today is April 19th, so it's confinement. We're stuck at home, and hopefully things will change quickly, because then I can go make videos of field operations, unlike this one. But I hope you like this one, and I hope it brought you some good information. Please consider patreon.com. The link is down below to help the channel. If you can, thank you very much. Have a good one.